Okay, so we're going to go ahead and talk about our last method of the semester, which is pentadic criticism. And the information for this chapter for this unit comes from chapter 11 from the Foss text. Okay, so as always, there is a sort of an underlying theory to the method that we are discussing. This method, of course, is pentadic criticism. The theory informing this method is the theory of dramatism. Now, dramatism is a theory that was put forth by Kenneth Burke. Hopefully that name is familiar to you. You should have talked about Kenneth Burke in COM 300, and if not COM 300, then at least COM 200. And so if you remember him, awesome, but if not, we're going to go ahead and discuss sort of the key points that you need to know for this particular method. So using pentadic criticism informed by the theory of dramatism, rhetorical critics evaluate how rhetors construct situations, issues, and problems in particular ways and place responsibility, blame, and or praise on particular elements of a rhetorical situation. Pentadic analysis aims to reveal what those constructions suggest about a rhetor's underlying worldview, motives, and ideology. So there's a lot to unpack in this paragraph, but here you can sort of see that there is a connection between this method and other methods that we have previously gone over. For example, ideological criticism. The word ideology and worldview, right, should signal that there is a connection between this method and ideological criticism, just as there was a connection between metaphor criticism and ideological criticism. And of course, that comes down to the reason that rhetoric is ideological and ideology is rhetorical, right? Which was what we discussed back when we discussed ideological criticism. So this particular method, the sort of goal of this method is to learn what a rhetor's underlying motives are. What is their motive? What is their intention? What is their worldview? What is their ideology, right? We can learn what that is by utilizing pentadic criticism, and in particular, paying very close attention to the way that a rhetor places responsibility, blame, or praise on certain elements of a situation. So pentadic analysis aims to reveal what those constructions suggest about a rhetor's worldview. So let's say you are talking to a friend, for example, and you are talking about, I don't know, racial justice, right? And you start talking about the protests and the uprisings for racial justice that have occurred in the last few years, and your friend is disagreeing with you and is saying, those were just a bunch of people who were thugs, who were looting. These were not protests, they were riots. You can see here that by analyzing this discussion and the way that you two are conceptualizing the same phenomenon in different ways by utilizing different words, right? Uprisings versus riots, right? Protests versus rallies, or whatever it is. We can get at what you all's differing worldviews are, right? Because we're paying very close attention to the words that you're using and how you're placing blame or praise on particular elements of your arguments. And that'll be a little bit clearer as we go on. I have a few examples here. So some of the key assumptions and concepts of dramatism. First of all, Kenneth Burke tells us in his theory of dramatism that life is a stage. To Kenneth Burke, humans develop and present messages like a drama or play by organizing them around actors, scenes, events, plots, etc. So for Kenneth Burke, communication or symbol use constitutes human social action, and communication is always a performance that constructs our social realities. So here we have this overarching metaphor of life as a stage, right? Again, a connection between what we're currently going over and previous methods that we've learned, such as metaphor criticism. So life is a stage. This is the overarching metaphor for the theory of dramatism. in this example, or in this sort of conceptualization, right, humans are developing and presenting messages, in other words, communicating, similarly to how a play or a drama would unfold, right? So to give you a brief example, let's say you're talking to a friend and you're talking about a car accident that you got into, or a fender bender. And you said, there I was at a red light, minding my own business, when this jerk comes speeding behind me and slams into the back of my car. And it was a whole thing, et cetera, et cetera. So in this example, it is pretty clear by the way that you are explaining the situation that you are trying to sort of insinuate certain things. First off, by saying, there I was minding my own business, you're sort of setting the stage for folks to interpret you as the innocent party here, right? Then you said, then out of nowhere comes this jerk, right? So you saying that is painting this other person as the villain in this play, right? So you can see here in this silly, simple example that in our everyday life, the way that we communicate with each other is often the way a play would unfold, with particular scenes, right? And different plots and different roles that the different actors in your play are playing, right? So that is sort of what or how Kenneth Burke is approaching communication with this theory. What's really key here, as I mentioned previously, is language, and that language provides clues to our motives. How a rhetor describes or constructs a situation indicates how they want audiences to perceive and act within that situation, right? So what's really important here are language choices as well as motives, right? As I mentioned in the previous slide, the goal of pentadic criticism is to learn or uncover or reveal what a rhetor's motives are, what their worldview is. And to do so, we have to pay attention to the language that they use. Now, one important concept to the theory of dramatism put forth by Kenneth Burke is the idea of terministic screens. So terministic screens are word choices that reflect a rhetor's worldview or ideology and shape how audiences perceive a situation or issue. So in my other example about the protests versus the riots, a prime example of terministic screens, right? These are two different terms, and that's where the idea of terministic comes from. These are two particular word choices that are very different, even though they're describing the same phenomenon. And they're very heavy with their own ideological meanings, right? And the idea of screens just means that with each word choice that we use, we are sort of putting a particular screen upon them. So when we are saying, these folks who are protesting for racial justice are just, engaging in violent riots, right? That is a sort of a screen that we're putting on this situation, because we want people who, our audience, to understand that our belief is that what they're doing is wrong, right? Whereas if we're talking in a different way, and we're saying, these are really passionate individuals who are protesting for racial justice. Again, you're describing the same phenomena, but those words that you're using, you are sort of framing that situation in a completely different light. So hence, word choices are incredibly important here. There's another word choice or set of word choices that I've been using throughout the semester as an example of why words matter, right? And that is describing a particular group of immigrants as either undocumented immigrants versus as, quote, illegal aliens, unquote, right? These are, again, describing the same phenomenon, but coming from two totally different worldviews, two totally different ideological meanings, right? And so here you can understand why word choices are so important. And in particular, they are important for this theory of dramatism. So framing is another key concept here. Framing refers to how rhetors construct a particular perception of an issue by organizing and structuring the raw details of a given situation or issue in a particular manner, with some details made more noticeable than others. So you could describe the uprisings that occurred a couple years ago, and you can say, yeah, there was so much looting and stealing and destruction and violence. Then you are clearly emphasizing particular things, right? You're emphasizing particular details, versus if you said, yeah, there was all of these amazing, there was a huge diversity of people who came together for a common cause. They seemed to really be passionate about this issue, and they were raising awareness about the injustices that have occurred, right, in our society. So here you are emphasizing unity, diversity, right, versus violence and destruction. Now, both of those may be true, but the way that you frame that situation or issue is very telling in regard to what your motive and your worldview and your ideological attitudes, beliefs, assumptions, expectations are, right? So lastly, another concept here given by Kenneth Burke, and Kenneth Burke is a very interesting individual. You can Wikipedia him later when you have a second. Very interesting person, but a brilliant rhetorical scholar nonetheless, and very philosophical. And here he says that every statement is a reflection of reality, but is also a selection of reality, and therefore a deflection of reality. So it's a reflection, it's a selection, and it's a deflection. Now, that may sound like a bunch of mumbo jumbo, but really what it means is that every phrase, every word that we use is a reflection of our reality, right? And by doing so, we are selecting the pieces of reality that we want to communicate. And therefore, by selecting that reality, right, those word choices, we are also deselecting, right? We're deflecting other word choices, other realities that we could communicate. Now, I know that we're not always so intentional with every word that comes out of our mouth, of course, but regardless of intention, right, we are still choosing to say certain things and not others. And by doing so, that is a reflection of our reality. So I know that may sound a little confusing. And the next slide, I'm going to go over an example that I think demonstrates all of this pretty well. So life is a stage, and the way that we use language provides clues to our motives. And some key concepts here to dramatism are deterministic screens, framing, and then this idea of every statement being a reflection of reality. So in this next slide here, in this next image, I have an image from 2005, so it's a bit dated when thinking about contemporary issues of our time, but yet it's incredibly relevant, I think, because it still happens today. So I have two news stories from the same news source, very similar images, and describing the exact same situation, and yet describing it very differently, right? So on one end, we see two people, and they are in this, awful murky water. Clearly, this is a situation of distress for them. They have backpacks on, kind of look a little disheveled in t-shirts, and what looks to be like a loaf of bread, maybe some water or some sort of beverage that is the woman is carrying and floating beside her. On the other end, on the other image, we have an image of a young boy, and he too, looks like very much in distress, and wading through this, chest deep water that's really murky and obviously not supposed to be happening. And floating along beside him he has like a 12-pack of like Pepsi or something, as well as a garbage bag, maybe of his belongings, maybe food, unclear. So, and this is both in the wake of Hurricane Katrina. So under the image with the two individuals, the caption reads, 2 residents wade through chest-deep water after finding bread and soda from a local grocery store after Hurricane Katrina came through the area in New Orleans, Louisiana. In the caption under the young boy, the caption reads, "A young man walks through chest-deep floodwater after looting a grocery store in New Orleans on Tuesday, August 30th, 2005. Floodwaters continue to rise in New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina did extensive damage when it hit." Okay, so here we can sort of understand the idea of framing. These are the exact same situational circumstances, but they're framed a lot differently. And we know that because of the deterministic screens that are used. First off, in the very beginning of these captions, we have with these 2 individuals, it says 2 residents. Now, residents seems to be a deterministic screen. It insinuates that these people live there in that community, right? They are residents of this community. On the other hand, this boy, we have a young man, right? So it's interesting because I think he looks sort of like a child, but regardless, they describe him as a young man, not a resident, right? As kind of this random young man who kind of came out of nowhere, right? And then we have an important verb here. 2 residents wade through water versus a young man walks through chest-deep floodwater. So it's interesting because it's one of the 2 important verbs here. Wading through water sounds a bit more like a struggle, right? We know that it's strenuous to wade through water. On the other hand, to describe this young boy as just walking through it insinuates that he's not really having a hard time, right? Even though it looks to me that he's definitely having a hard time. And then we have the most important verb here. 2 residents wade through chest-deep water after finding bread and soda versus a young man walks through chest-deep floodwater after looting a grocery store. So finding versus looting. Again, more deterministic screens. Finding insinuates resourcefulness, right? It insinuates that these people they innocently came upon these food items that they need to survive. Versus looting, well, that certainly insinuates an element of a criminal element, right? It insinuates that a crime has taken place and a crime is illegal, right? So it insinuates a sense of illegal activity. But it's interesting because it's describing the same thing. But on one end, these folks have found something innocently, and on the other, this young boy has looted the grocery store. So I bring this to our attention because this happens all the time. And in this particular instance, the only difference I see is skin color, right? And this is not the only instance. There are so many examples of this same sort of discourse that occurs in news media, right? We can even think about today, the court case that's going on right now with Kyle Rittenhouse, the young white man who crossed state lines with an illegally attained firearm to attend a protest for racial justice, and in which he shot and killed 2 people. Now he is on trial. The judge has ordered that the prosecution are not allowed to use the terms victims when referring to the 2 people that he shot and killed. But what is allowed is that the defense can describe those individuals who were murdered or killed. They can describe them as rioters or looters. So it's really interesting, again, sort of the types of language choices that is allowed, the type of language choices that we use to describe people. It just goes to show that, words do matter. Words are often a life and death matter. And the way that we describe situations also matters. So here is a good example of how you can frame 2 different stories, even though you're describing the same phenomenon, right? Now, let's move on to the most important piece of this method, which is the pentad. So I've been saying pentadic criticism, but I haven't actually explained what the heck what pentadic means, right? So pentadic comes from the term pentad, and pentad means 5. So the sort of process of doing pentadic criticism, of course, involves looking at language choices, examining these language choices for ideological meanings and worldviews, and ultimately motives. But it is a systematic approach. And systematic meaning there's a system, there's a process, there's a procedure. Now, how you go about this procedure is by examining and explaining these 5 different elements that comprise the pentad. So these elements are as follows: the act, the agent, the scene, the purpose, and agency. So act refers to what happened, what is being described in this artifact. Agent is who did the act and what are their characteristics. So who is the artifact describing? What did this, who is the person that's responsible for this act? And how are they being described? What are their characteristics? Now the scene, how is the artifact describing the scene of when the act happened? Where and when did this act happen? Purpose. Purpose is why did the act happen? Now, it's extremely important to remember that purpose is not asking you, what is the purpose of this artifact? It is asking, what was the purpose of the act, right? Refer back to the act, number 1. So purpose refers to why did this act happen? Huge and very common mistake is to start answering these questions in a way that is incorrect. So purpose, why did the act happen? And number 5, agency. This might be the only term that you're not extremely familiar with. So agency is how did the act happen, or what enabled it to happen? So pentadic criticism asks you to identify each of the elements above and to interpret how the rhetor describes and constructs these elements. Now, the very, very, very important thing to know here is that you are applying this pentad to the content of the message in your artifact, not to the act of delivering the message. So, for example, if the artifact that you are analyzing is a speech given by Donald Trump, let's say, the pentad, you are identifying the act, agent, scene, purpose, and agency based on the message that Donald Trump is giving in his speech. What is he describing? How is he describing it, right? You are not applying the pentad to the actual literal act of Donald Trump giving the speech. So what I mean here is, in this example, the act is not Donald Trump gave a speech, and the agent is not Donald Trump, and the scene isn't the White House, and the purpose isn't the inaugural address. Like, that is not what we're doing here. And this is why this method is so tricky, because it's very easy to get confused and to apply this pentad to the literal phenomenon of what's happening versus the actual artifact itself. And I'm going to keep reiterating this fact because it's so common to misunderstand this particular method. So when doing pentadic criticism, the focus is always on how the situation or problem in the artifact is being discussed, is being constructed, not on the delivery of the message itself. So again, with a speech, unless the person speaking is specifically talking about themselves, the person speaking is never the agent. The act is never just giving a speech. And the scene is never just where the speech was given. And the purpose is not the purpose of why that person gave the speech. This is where most people get tripped up. When analyzing purpose, again, you're looking at why, according to the rhetor, a situation or problem has happened, not what a speaker is attempting to accomplish by giving a speech. And I have further examples to illustrate this, but this is very, very important. So how to go about analyzing or identifying these elements. It's not enough to just watch an artifact and then say, here we go, I got all the elements, right? It's going to take some thought. It's going to take a process. So there are things called ratios and ratio pairings. Now, if you're like me, you hate math and you're very scared of it. And this is not necessarily going to involve math per se, just a sort of mathematical terminology. So ratios in this context are the systematic pairings of two pentadic terms to analyze how one term influences the other. Now stick with me, I know this is a little bit weird. So systematic, again, indicates that there is a system, there's a process, there's a procedure. So this process here is not something that you're going to be doing in your actual essay or in your actual MAE, right? This is the behind the scenes work that gets you to the identification of the 5 pentadic elements. This is what you should be doing on your own, right? So when you watch an artifact, let's say it's a speech, you are going to start pairing up each of these terms in order to figure out which term is the most dominant term. Because there are 5 elements, right? Act, agent, agency, scene, and purpose. There are therefore 20 possible ratio pairings. An example would be pairing scene and act, scene and agent, scene and agency, scene and purpose, or, act and agent, act and scene, act and purpose, etc. So for each of these pairings, you would ask yourself, does the first term in the ratio significantly influence our understanding of the second? Your goal by doing these pairings is to discover which term is dominant or controlling. And identifying which term exerts the most influence on all of the other terms is very key to understand the rhetor's underlying motive or worldview or ideology. And that in itself is the purpose of this entire method, is to get at a rhetor's underlying motives, right? So revealing where the rhetor places primary responsibility for the situation, issue, or problem provides insight into the rhetor's underlying beliefs, values, assumptions, and or strategies and goals. Super important. So if your artifact is a commercial, for example, then on your own, right, when you're doing your analysis, you would do all of these systematically. You would go through these 20 possible ratio pairings, and you would say, okay, is the scene in this artifact, in this commercial, does it influence the act that the commercial is showing, or is it not really that important, right? If it's not that important, you move on to the second one, scene agent. Now, maybe this one is important. Maybe the agent is not even possible unless that particular scene was set up. In that way, you can tell that these terms are really important, and perhaps one of those terms is a dominant term that exerts the most influence over all of the other terms, right? And I know it's a bit abstract, so we are going to go through another example here in a minute. Okay, so pentads reveal insight, very important. After coming up with your pentad, so after you have gone through the 20 ratio pairings and you have identified the 5 elements of the pentad, act, agent, scene, purpose, and agency, you would ask yourself, does this pentad reveal insight about the artifact? Specifically, does this pentad reveal the motives or worldview or ideology of the rhetor? If not, you would need to start over, right? This is a sort of a thoughtful, analytical, critical process where you might have some trial and error before immediately coming up with the right answers, right? Now, this method, like all other methods, is tough. It asks you to dig below the surface to examine the content of the message within the artifact, not the production of the artifact, okay? So critics should analyze the picture that the artifact is painting, not describe simple facts about who created the artifact. Critics should examine the story being told by the artifact. So let's say I gave you the artifact of the commercial, the Lumber 84 Super Bowl commercial that you all wrote about for your ideological criticism MAE. Let's say that's your artifact here and you're trying to conduct a pentadic analysis, right? So if you're doing that, the act isn't the Super Bowl created a commercial and the agent isn't, Lumber 84. And the purpose is not to raise awareness about immigration. You see, if you do it that way, then you are just describing simple facts about who created the artifact. That's not what this is asking you to do. Pentadic criticism is asking you as a rhetorical critic to examine the picture that's being painted by the artifact, the story being told by the artifact. So instead, the act in that commercial would be an immigrant's journey, and the agent would be immigrants. And the agency, right? How the act occurred. Remember, how the act occurred or what enabled the act to occur is the agency. So if you remember, you all wrote a lot about how the journey that was being portrayed in this commercial depicted the immigrant's journey as very arduous, very strenuous, very difficult, right? And so here in this example, the agency or how the act occurred would be perseverance and strength, right? So you can see here by analyzing by doing a pentadic analysis in this way, the correct way, you are revealing some insight about the artifact. Now, if you fall into the trap of just listing literal facts about the artifact, you're not doing it properly. And so that's why this is such a weird and tough and tricky method. So moving on, artifacts and guiding research questions. So pentadic criticism is a great method to use for most traditional rhetorical artifacts. And it works well when applied to one artifact, and it works well when applied to two contrasting artifacts, which can provide insight into the different ways that the same situation is constructed and reveal possible implications of those differing messages, right? And so in this way, the types of artifacts that worked best for this type of pentadic criticism are news stories and clips, political speeches, campaign ads, commercials, advertisements, recruitment ads and videos, and other similar artifacts with hidden intentions or agendas that a rhetorician may use pentadic criticism to reveal. I personally think this is a great method, but it's not one of the more popular ones to use for the final essay, probably because it's a bit tricky. The guiding research questions for this method, and remember, FOSS provides us with guiding research questions for every method, would be: how does the rhetor construct the act, agent, scene, agency, and purpose of this situation, and which element is dominant? That is basically your research question if you use this method in your final essay. And secondly, as with all methods, I'm going to ask you to consider what are the implications of constructing this situation in this way. So that being said, these types of artifacts like news stories and clips and political speeches, all of those work really well for this particular method. And so if you're interested in examining maybe journalistic artifacts or speeches or things like that, this would be a great method to use. Okay, so moving on. I created what I call Pentadic Pitfalls because I've taught this course for several years now. And I now know what the most common mistakes are for students who are using this method in their MAE and using this method in their final essay. And I compiled them all into 3 main pentadic pitfalls. And so I'm going to go over those with you right now. So pentadic pitfall number 1, confusing the agent with the rhetor. So many folks fall into the trap of confusing the agent with the rhetor. Do not conflate these two. The rhetor is the individual or the organization or the company that literally produced the rhetoric or the artifact. The agent is the person or people or group that the rhetor is addressing or talking about. All right, so those are not the same thing. Pentadic pitfall number 2, confusing the purpose with the motive. Now, I just went over that in a couple slides ago. So the purpose refers to why the act occurred. The purpose is not referring to why the rhetor produced the artifact. A rhetorical critic engaging in pentadic criticism should first identify the pentad and then identify the controlling or dominant term. And then lastly, based on all of these findings, they then determine what the rhetor's motives are for framing that situation in that particular way. Now, the motives is the very last thing you do after coming up with your pentad. So purpose and motive is not the same thing. It sounds similar, but in this context, it's not the same thing. When you are labeling the purpose in your pentad, you are referring to why the act occurred. Pentadic pitfall number 3, analyzing the production of the message or the artifact and not the actual message. So as I've said before, pentadic criticism is tricky, right? So you need to remember to focus on analyzing the story being told by the artifact, not describing surface level facts about the production of the artifact. This method is not asking you to just, relay facts, because that's not insightful, right? So instead, critics should dig below the surface to examine the situation being described and constructed by the artifact. All right, so these are the 3 main pentadic pitfalls. Number 1, confusing the agent with the rhetor. Number 2, confusing the purpose with the motive. And number 3, analyzing the production of the artifact and not the actual message that's being portrayed or painted or told by the artifact. This method is not asking you to list facts, right? Critics must dig deep below the surface to examine the situation that's being described or constructed in the artifact. Hope that makes sense. Now, I compiled this list of pitfalls because I really want you to do well on the MAE. And if you do well on the MAE, then, and you do it correctly, then you're in good shape if you would like to choose this method for your final essay. If you did not do the MAE, or if you do not do the MAE correctly, the final MAE on pentadic criticism, then I do not recommend that you use this method for the final essay. All right. Now I'm going to go through one last slide, and then we're going to go to a example. So analyzing the artifact. First, you would need to identify, label, and describe each element of the pentad. And in doing so, just remember that identification and labeling elements is a rhetorical act in and of itself, right? So you are already, doing something very rhetorical. You're not just naming and labeling, right? You're also describing what qualities and characteristics the rhetor associates with each of these elements. Your essay should identify each element. And this is, again, if you're writing about, if you're using this for the final essay, but you can spend more time interpreting or discussing the most important elements. So while your essay should label all of the elements, and the MAE that you'll have in a couple of weeks, or do in a couple of weeks, will ask you to label all of the elements. But in general, you can focus on the pairings that you find most important. So to do that, you would break the elements into ratios to identify the dominant or controlling term. You would explore each of the 20 ratio pairings to discover which element seems to affect the others most significantly. Now, don't include this 20 ratio pairings in your essay, right? That's not what your essay should be comprised of. You would just discuss the most significant or relevant findings or ratio pairings in your essay. The essay wouldn't be comprised of just like all of these different ratio pairings. That's what you do behind the scenes. You would use your identification of the pentadic elements and the controlling term that you have found to make a claim about how the rhetor constructs the situation and what this suggests about the rhetor's underlying motives, worldview, or ideology. And this is basically your thesis statement right there. And lastly, as always, I'm going to ask you to consider the implications. And in this sense, you would be considering the implications of constructing this issue in this way through this pentad. Optional, if you're really into this and you're good at it, you can consider what alternative constructions or pentads might be possible, right? And I asked that question on the metaphor MAE, right? Where I ask you, like, what are some alternative metaphors that are not discussed in the artifact, right? So that's just sort of a advanced level or next step. And I mentioned these next steps because we've been going over and practicing rhetorical analysis all semester long, but you don't have to do that. It's optional. So this is sort of how you go about using pentadic criticism. You identify, you label, and describe each of these elements, right? The 5 elements. You break them into different pairs to figure out which one of those 5 elements are the most important, is the most important or controlling term. And then you would make a claim about how the rhetor is describing this situation through the use of this pentad, what that reveals about that rhetor's worldviews. And I will just pause here for a couple more seconds in case you're taking any notes, and then we will move on. I'll stop the recording here and we will engage in a quick exercise to demonstrate all of these various concepts. All right.